Hello, Sean here, and welcome back to the Bond in Context series, where we're investigating the historical context of the James Bond movies. It's been a long time since the last video in this series, more than a year in fact, and a great deal has changed since then, including the release of the new James Bond movie, which was supposed to come out last month, April 2020, has now been delayed until November thanks to the COVID-19 pandemic. A lot of other things have changed, but I would still like to get back to this series. There's still a lot of movies still to go and a lot of really interesting history. So even though it's been a long time, I thought I would start again where we left off. So this video is going to be different than all the others in the series. The last video that I completed more than a year ago was on License to Kill. That was the second Timothy Dalton picture, which came out in 1989. However, it was 6 years, 1995, before the release of the next film, GoldenEye. And historically speaking, those 6 years were among the most momentous years of the entire 20th century, a time in which the world changed dramatically. Since this video series is about historical context, I feel like we can't really jump into GoldenEye without talking about what happened in that gap. So that's why this is a slightly different video. It's not going to be specifically about a movie, but about what happened between the movies, specifically between License to Kill and GoldenEye. First things first, why did the gap happen in the first place? Since 1977, a new Bond film had been released like clockwork every 2 years. Had they followed this same schedule, there would have been a James Bond movie out in 1991, probably starring Timothy Dalton, whose contract had specified 3 films, and as of 1989 he'd made 2. So indeed, originally this was the plan. However, a couple of things happened. The money men at the top of MGM, which was the parent company of United Artists, the studio that released the Bond films, were disappointed at the take from License to Kill. The overall producer of the series, Albert Broccoli, who'd been at the helm since the beginning, since 1962, was also getting disillusioned. In 1990, Broccoli parted ways with Richard Maibaum, who was the screenwriter who'd been writing most of the Bond films since the early 60s. He also fired John Glenn, not the astronaut, but the director who had done all the Bond films made in the 80s. Also in 1990, MGM was bought out by a European media conglomerate. This ignited a big legal battle, which was mainly over broadcast rights of the past Bond films. As the legal battle raged on, the clock was running out on Dalton's contract. Now, I said a minute ago that he was obligated to do 3 films, but even if he didn't complete all 3, his contract was up in 1993. By the time the legal mess was settled in late 1992, there wasn't enough time left to make another film before Dalton's contract was up. The expiration of Dalton's contract, though, did not mean that he was out of the role. Throughout 1993, he did remain theoretically attached to the role of James Bond. What they would have done was a one-picture-at-a-time deal, as they had done for Roger Moore in his later films. But then quite suddenly, in the spring of 1994, Dalton himself took himself out of the running. This caused another delay, while the producers found another actor. Production on GoldenEye did not get rolling until January of 1995. By that time, though, the world was totally different than it had been in 1989 when the last film came out. In terms of world events, political and social change, the period from 1989 to 1995 was almost as momentous as the 6-year period between 1939 and 1945, the years between the beginning and ending of World War II. First things first, we had the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War, which occurred in November 1989, only a few months after the release of License to Kill. The opening of the wall was only the most dramatic moment in a rapid period of upheaval in the Soviet bloc states of Eastern and Central Europe. This occurred largely because these governments, Soviet satellite nations set up in the aftermath of World War II, ceased to be actively propped up by Moscow. The Soviet Union was largely broke, a result of a stagnating economy, unusually low oil prices, and military spending in keeping up the arms race with the United States. In addition to dwindling finances, Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev realized that backstopping those Soviet puppet states in Eastern Europe was politically very difficult and ultimately not worth the effort. Beginning with Poland and Hungary in the late summer of 1989, then East Germany and Czechoslovakia in the fall, Gorbachev did nothing to prevent emboldened reform movements within these countries from challenging one-party communist leadership that had held since the 1940s. The opening of immigration from East to West Berlin was clearly the most photogenic part of this process. Another dramatic development was the overthrow of communist dictator Nicolae Ceausescu in Romania in late December and his execution on Christmas Day 1989. Gorbachev did want to hang on to some of the breakaway republics, like the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, which Gorbachev was willing to use military force to try to hang on to, at least on a fairly small scale. It didn't end up working. In early 1990, the Baltic republics, which were technically part of the USSR, unlike those Eastern European satellite states, declared independence, so it took them some time to fully get it. The breakup of the Soviet Empire continued pretty rapidly. By mid-1990, Gorbachev was scrambling to keep the Soviet Union itself together. His plan to allow modest political and economic reforms within the USSR had spun badly out of his control, and pretty soon events were taking on a momentum of their own. With East Germany's communist government gone, talks were already underway for the formal reunification of East and West Germany, which officially happened in early October 1990. By this time, the West was distracted with its own crisis in the Middle East. In August 1990, Saddam Hussein, the dictator of Iraq, invaded Kuwait, one of the oil-rich Gulf states, primarily so Saddam, whose country had been bankrupted by the Iran-Iraq War in the 80s, could plunder its resources and its oil revenues. At first, in the days after the Kuwaiti invasion, everybody feared that Hussein's next target would be Saudi Arabia, which was very lightly defended against Iraq's massive army. Now, President Bush, we're talking about Bush the First, was eager to protect Saudi Arabia, which supplied a significant chunk of the United States' oil imported from overseas. The king of Saudi Arabia formally requested American troops to defend his country from the potential attack by Saddam. In that decision, taken in early August 1990, lay one of the seeds of 9/11. Osama bin Laden, who had founded al-Qaeda 2 years earlier, would later cite the presence of American troops in the country where the holy sites of Mecca and Medina were located as one of his many grievances against the United States, and hence the reason for the 9/11 attack. American troops have been stationed in Saudi Arabia continually since 1990, by the way. Of course, you probably know how the military game turned out, or perhaps you don't know. I've found in my teaching that the first Persian Gulf War is surprisingly obscure in people's memories, which is really hard to believe if you lived through it and remember all the hype that surrounded it, especially in the media. Suffice it to say, a multinational coalition of countries, led by the United States, carried on a brief but decisive war against Iraq in early 1991 to reverse Saddam's invasion of Kuwait, but not to remove Hussein from power. Notably, this coalition did not include the Soviet Union, although Gorbachev did not do anything politically or diplomatically to interfere with this process. The Soviets were already chastened by their experience in Afghanistan, which ended in early 1989. We talked about that in the Living Daylights video. And they had no stomach for getting drawn into another conflict in the Middle East. During the run-up to the Persian Gulf War in November 1990, in fact on Thanksgiving Day as it was celebrated in the United States, British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher was deposed. Maggie, we've seen a lot of her in this series, finally exits stage right. She was taken out in an intra-party leadership election when her own Conservative Party, which was then looking ahead to another general election, probably in 1991, decided that they were better off without her than with her. Thatcher herself had fully intended to run for a fourth election in 1991, and evidently she was convinced that she would win, although polling indicated otherwise. To preserve at least the chance of victory going into that election, the Conservatives deposed Margaret Thatcher and leadership of Britain passed to John Major, still a Conservative, but at least a different face. The British elections, postponed a bit, ended up happening in April 1992. most people thought that Major couldn't pull it off and that Labour, under the leadership of Neil Kinnock, was primed to win. The election result was generally a surprise. Major and the Conservative Party did pull off a pretty impressive win, for which conservatives spun media, particularly the Sun newspaper, claimed partial credit for. The Sun was owned by Rupert Murdoch, who would later consolidate control over conservative media in the United States through his ownership of Fox News. By 1992, the Soviet Union had undergone its final collapse. In August 1991, an attempted coup by communist hardliners, furious with Gorbachev and his policies of engaging with the West, tried to overthrow him. The coup did not go so well, partly because the new president of Russia, Boris Yeltsin, urged the people of Moscow to resist. But the plotters themselves also botched it. One of them was famously found in his office, dead from a self-inflicted gunshot wound surrounded by empty vodka bottles. In any event, although Gorbachev survived the coup, it had the effect of accelerating the breakup of the USSR, the rest of whose federated republics quickly declared independence. On Christmas Day, 1991, the Soviet Union ceased to exist. Yeltsin became the head of state of Russia. In just a few short years, the entire Soviet Empire was gone. The last of the big players to leave the scene during this period was George Bush himself. Although he seemed invincible after the success of the Persian Gulf War in early 1991, Bush's political capital went very quickly down the toilet as a result of numerous domestic policy missteps, chief among them his tepid response to a severe economic recession that struck beginning in 1990 and intensified in the next 2 years. So therefore, Bush went into his re-election campaign in 1992 greatly weakened and generally ran a pretty limp and lifeless campaign. The Democrats nominated Bill Clinton, governor of Arkansas, and the 1992 election turned out to be one of the most unusual presidential contests in U.S. history. So by 1993, almost every historical condition that's formed the context of the Bond movies, or at least the last 15 years of Bond movies, has been changed. Cold War over. Soviet Union, the big geopolitical threat, gone. Conservatives out of power in the United States, Thatcher gone in Britain, though conservatives still hanging on, but still a thoroughly different world than had existed in 1988. Interestingly, the next Bond film, GoldenEye, which began production in early 1995, would embrace these massive changes. A major theme in GoldenEye, underscored by the credits sequence, is the fall of communism and the end of the Cold War, and the question of whether Bond was still relevant in this radically changed world. So that's where we will pick up in the next video on GoldenEye. Thanks for watching.